Welcome to this session on IPR, and in today's session I will be talking about intellectual property and traditional cultural expressions. So in this session I will be talking about what is TCE, traditional cultural expression, what are the characteristics of traditional cultural expression, the meaning of traditional cultural expressions, and why we should protect traditional cultural expressions, and what is the relation of traditional cultural expressions with other IPs, intellectual property rights. First of all, let us understand what is traditional cultural expression. So before going into the meaning of traditional cultural expressions, we should understand that any person is known by the way he or she expresses or gives his expression. For example, if you belong to a particular community, you definitely stand apart from the society, and the society will definitely understand that this person is belonging to a particular community. How? Let me give you an example. If you are from the South India or if you are from the Northeast, if you are staying in a metro, by some or the other way, the way you dress up or the way you talk, you will be identified by your culture. So culture is a very important aspect of human being. Culture is organic in nature, and cultural heritage is always in a permanent form of production. The culture reflects in everyday functioning of a person in varied forms, which can be like dressing up, eating habits, and also other various ways in which a person from a particular community interacts with the outer world. The various manifestations of traditional culture and cultural heritage are therefore often a source of creativity for indigenous, local, and cultural communities. Now, folklore is probably the most important and well-acclaimed component of the cultural heritage of a nation. And the folk, it identifies with a specific community, whether it is tribal or non-tribal, and lore specifies the collective knowledge or wisdom on a particular subject. So if we speak about the meaning of traditional cultural expression, though we do not have a set definition of traditional cultural expressions, traditional cultural expressions are often considered by communities as a single and indivisible part of their cultural heritage. Therefore, traditional and indigenous communities, they have long sought respect and recognition for their creative expressions, ranging from stories, myths, folk tales, songs, and music to symbols, designs, paintings, sculptures, carvings, handicrafts, dances, and rituals. And TCEs are now recognized as a key element of the well-being and sustainable development, as well as the cultural vitality of the indigenous and traditional communities. So that is one of the reasons why traditional cultural expressions should be protected, because traditional cultural expression is attributed to a particular community. That is why a particular person cannot go and say that this is my knowledge or this is my attribute only. So since it is attributed to a community, so the entire community is considered to be having the knowledge of that particular tradition or indigenous knowledge. So that is the reason why these traditional cultural expressions, since it is attributed to a community, it cannot be protected under a particular IPR, and therefore there should be a separate legislation which we'll be talking about in this session. Now, these also includes traditional music, design, rituals, performances, oral narratives, names, symbols and signs, and communicate a community's belief and values, reflect a community's history, and also define its cultural identity. Coming to the meaning of the term TCE, traditional cultural expressions. Now, as I told you, there is no set definition of traditional cultural expressions. But however, WIPO uses the word traditional cultural expressions interchangeably with folklore. And if we see the meaning of the term TCEs, it has been defined by different nations as traditional cultural expressions. They have been synonymous used as traditional cultural expressions as well as expressions of folklore, indigenous culture, intangible and tangible cultural heritage, and indigenous heritage. So in other words, we can say traditional cultural expressions means that a particular tradition of a community, the way it has been expressed is known as the traditional cultural expressions. We also use it interchangeably as folklore or expressions of folklore, because folk is actually whether folk actually defines whether it is a tribal or non-tribal way of expression, and lore is the wisdom of the people. So that is why the word folklore. It also, traditional cultural expressions can also be expressed as or known as indigenous culture, because it belongs to a particular community which has been passed from one generation to another generation. That is why it is known as this indigenous culture. Or it may be new, or it may not be new, or it may be evolving, it may be an old tradition, or it is also evolving. However, but still it is followed by the traditional, in a traditional manner by the community, so it is known as an indigenous culture or a traditional culture. It is also known as intangible and tangible cultural heritage, and of course as known as the indigenous heritage. Why heritage? Because it is something which is being which has a very significant role in the for the community, for that particular community, as it can also be used as a way of sustenance. It can be used, and it is being used as a way of sustenance for that particular community. Now, how do we know that what is traditional cultural expressions, and how we can get they can seek protection? The people or the community can seek protection by saying that it is their traditional cultural expressions. For that, it is very important to understand the characteristics of traditional cultural expressions. The World Intellectual Property Organizations has made a complete list, which is inclusive, which is also an inclusive list. It is not an exhaustive list. It is an inclusive list in which it has defined that by this characteristics, if it has this type of characteristics, it may come under the purview of traditional cultural expressions. Now we will see what are the characteristics of traditional cultural expressions. It is said that TCEs are integral to the cultural and social identities of indigenous and traditional communities, and therefore they reflect a community's cultural and social identity. So if it has a characteristics of this kind, that it reflects a community's cultural and social identity, then it can be considered to be a traditional cultural expression. Again, TCEs are said to be expressions of community's knowledge and consist of characteristics elements of a community's heritage. So if they are expressions of community's knowledge and consist of characteristics elements of community's heritage, then they have a characteristic of TCE and they are considered to be a TCE. They are often created for spiritual and religious purposes. Now for that, if they have been created, if a particular community believes in a particular spiritual and religious belief, has a religious belief, then it needs to protection. Of course, the spiritual belief or the religious purpose should not be that it should harm a particular or some other community or some person. But if it is of that kind that the particular community believes on that spiritual and religious purposes, then it is definitely a characteristic of traditional cultural expressions. Here, if I relate it with the Kamakhya temple, so if you see that there are a lot of tantrics there, Kamakhya temple is considered to be a temple which has a religious belief where tantric seva has been done for a very long time. They have a religious belief in that. They have a spiritual belief in that. And earlier it was said that they used to give, bali also of people, of animals, and that was considered to be a bad part of the tantric vidya which was practiced there. But now if you go and see that spiritual and religious belief which they have, which the Kamakhya temple has, is now they're not following, they're not giving bali for that, but they have a spiritual and religious for that purposes they have been following that. So now respecting that tantric vidya which they are performing, or which they are acquiring, or for what purposes they are doing, if they're not harming any other person, then we should definitely respect that, and that can be considered to be a characteristics of traditional cultural expressions. Again, coming to TCEs are generally made by authors unknown and or by communities and or by individuals communally recognized as having the right, responsibility or permission to do so in accordance with the customary law and practices of that community. Now, since the TCEs are made by authors unknown, now it has been, we definitely know that the traditional cultural expression is not a particular person's skill. it is attributed to a particular community, and we do not know who has started this tradition or from where the skill has come. So we can say that it is a person who is unknown, or a community, because it is now we do not know that person, and this particular tradition has been passed from generation to generation. So definitely it is attributed to a particular community who has been following it from generations, or by individuals of a community, or who recognize this as a right of their own. And they are not only a right, but because with right comes responsibilities also, they also consider it as the responsibilities, and so they require a permission to do so, to practice that in accordance with the customary law and practices of that community. So the customary laws and practices of that particular community allows that, because we know that custom always precedes legislation. Whenever there is a custom and we think that there should be a law, if the custom is well enough, custom always precedes, a custom always is considered to be a better law than the legislation. So we don't actually require a law if there is a custom which has been followed from generations and is good enough for the community to follow. So if the custom allows that this practices should be allowed of that particular community, then definitely we should allow that custom, and that definitely we can say that it has a characteristics of traditional cultural expression. Again, coming to another point, TCEs are handed down from one generation to another, either orally or by imitation, which depicts oral nature and of traditional cultural expressions and the oral transmissions of those cultural expressions. We know that traditional knowledge or traditional cultural expressions are being orally transmitted from generations to other generations, because at that time writing was not there, it was not codified anywhere. So it has been definitely transferred from generation to generation through oral, word of mouth, to the word of mouth, by mouth or by imitation. So if they have been practicing something, some knowledge or some tradition, for example artisans, or for example music, or you can see the Kalbelia dance of Rajasthan, which is also known as the Sapera dance. And this tradition, this dance has been practiced from generations. The people who are known as the Saperas of Rajasthan, they've been doing this dance. This is a folk of their, you can say a folk dance of these community from generations. So definitely this is something which has been imitated by the people who are coming generations, and in a form of expressions, because they've been learning that steps from the day they have been born. So this type of tradition, if they have an attribute of this type, which is being imitated or which is being orally transmitted from generation to generation, we can say that they have a characteristics of TCEs, and they are a TCE, and they should be, they can consider to be for a protection, they can go for a protection under the intellectual property rights. TCEs are constantly evolving. Just like traditional knowledge, we can say that TCEs are constantly evolving. It is not that it is a static type of skill, which is once it's been formed, it is now no more, or we cannot evolve it anymore. So there are innovations in it. So definitely TCEs are constantly evolving, developing, and being recreated within the community, thereby depicting the intergenerational nature of traditional cultural expressions. So as we know that necessity is the mother of invention. So if a particular TCE has been, for example, the skills artisans, you can see that the people from Banaras, the skill artisans of Banaras, they've been weaving Banarsi saris from generations. So, but we cannot say that this skill is not evolving. The new generation people who are coming into the weaving of Banarsi saris, now they are not following the same set pattern. Looking into the needs of the new generation people, the people around, now they are weaving the saris in such a manner that they can be customized or fit into the role, or fit into the new generation role, because now the people who are from today's generation, they would like something different. Definitely they would like to have Banarsi sari, but in a different pattern, which would fit to today's customs. So looking into that, the new generation people who are into the weaving, they would now evolve the same skill in a manner which would fit the today's generation. So we can say the TCs are constantly evolving. They're not static. They are evolving as per the needs of today's generation, as per the needs of, and thus depicting the intergenerational nature of traditional cultural expressions. So the generation which were earlier, they had a different set of belief. Now the different new generation, they are putting into innovations, they are innovating the same thing, and thus depicting that there is a intergenerational nature, and it is something which is evolving. TCs are not static, but something which is evolving. Coming to another characteristics of TCs, TCs transmit core values and beliefs and embody know-how and skills, and thus can be regarded as cultural and economic assets of the community. The importance of social milieu in defining traditional cultural expressions cannot be ignored. So we can say that TCs, they transmit the core values and beliefs and embody know-how and skills, and thus it can be regarded as the cultural and economic assets of the community, because they also sustain, they have, through this skill of their own. So through this traditional cultural expressions, for example, people who are artisans, people who are handicraft people, these all are a part of, these are, you can say, an example of traditional cultural expressions. So they get their economic, because of the economic rewards or whatever economic value they're getting, they are also sustaining. So you can say that these are the importance of, these are also the economic assets of that particular community. Now coming to another important aspect, that now because we have seen the characteristics of traditional cultural expressions, we can say that TCs, they depict an extremely complex reality whose limits are difficult to define. We cannot define it because they don't come under a particular definition. They may be music, they may be a type of skill, it may be a particular, story, or whatever, a number of things which come under the TCs. So normally in the developing countries, and especially in the indigenous groups in industrialized countries, folklore is generally regarded as communally rather than individually possessed, which we have already seen that it does not attributes to a particular person, but it attributes to a particular community. So we can say, and another very important aspect which we have, after reading that TCs, the characteristics of TCs, we can say the TCs are not static, but they are highly dynamic living system, because they are changing with the generations. There is a lot of innovation in it, and the people who are coming in the recent times, they are innovating, doing innovation, and so thus we can say it is constantly in the process of innovation, creation and recreation. Now, what are the subject matter which are covered under the traditional cultural expressions? We also see the subject matter which are covered in the special TCs. Depending on the form of expressions, TCs, they can be divided into 4 groups. First is the verbal expressions, such as legends, folk stories and poetry. So if a particular community has been following or has been telling stories from generations, which are now known as legends, folk stories and poetry, even Ramayana, Mahabharata, they are nothing but stories, folk stories, and now they have become they have been passed from one generation to another generation through the word of mouth. It was written quite late by Vedas, but earlier it was passed on from one generation to another generation. These are also nothing but folk stories and legends. Coming to musical expressions, as I told you, Kalbelia dance, it is a folk dance. Similarly, we have folk songs and instrumental musics which have been followed from one generation to another generation. Expression by action such as dances, plays and shows. Even dances, plays and shows, they have been followed from one generation to another generation in a particular community, which we see that again, like our grandmothers used to say stories, and which we've been hearing from such generations, in every generation we hear the same story. Of course, there is some innovation in the story, because now when we tell the same stories to us, children, we innovate something, because now the children have different, they have mobiles in their hands, so we make the story something like that, or they have much technical things in their hands, so we make the story in such a form that now revolving around today's generation. But the stories are the same, the concept is the same, but now there is a lot of innovation, because depending upon today's tradition or today's custom, today's people. Again, the subject matter, one of the subject matter of TCs are They are tangible expressions such as production of folk art, especially drawings, paintings, sculptures, pottery, jewels, costumes, musical instruments, as well as architectural works. Giving an example of the Madhubani paintings, these are nothing but a special drawing which have been followed from generations. Now, earlier in the drawings, you would see something different, more like the drawings would depict more, you can say, gods, and the paintings would revolve around gods and mythological aspects. But now, depending again upon the generation, today's generation, now they are made under different themes. So whatever the themes, but the paintings are the same, but the themes are different now, because now today's generation is using a lot of innovation in it and upon the likings of what today's generation wants. So we can say that the subject matters which are covered under traditional cultural expressions, they are these four: the verbal expressions, the musical expressions, the expressions by action, and tangible expressions. And this I've already given examples like legends, folk stories and poetry, folk songs and instrumental music, dances, plays and shows, and productions of folk art like jewelry, paintings, sculptures, and pottery, jewels, costumes, so many other things. Even the architectural works. Why I tell you architectural works? Because when you go to the South India, you will see gopurams. The Dravidian culture has been depicted in the gopurams. When you go to a temple in South India, what you see? You will never see the gopurams in the North India. But in the South India, especially in Tamil Nadu, you will see the mandirs or the temples have gopurams. So this is the architectural work of people from South India. And we need to preserve this traditional cultural expressions of these people. So definitely we can say that this is something which is a traditional cultural expression, and which we will not find in any other part of the country. Coming to the main, very important thing, the reasons for the protection of traditional cultural expressions. Now, we have seen what is traditional cultural expressions, what is the meaning of traditional cultural expressions, what is the subject matter of traditional cultural expressions, what are the characteristics of traditional cultural expressions. Now, let's see the reasons for the protection of traditional cultural expressions. People from a particular community, or people from the indigenous people, the people from the indigenous people, we can say indigenous people or traditional people from a community, they all have reasons for the protection of TCs. They say that why they require the protection of traditional cultural expressions. One, for spiritual, for non-economic reasons, for the integrity, authenticity, spiritual meaning of certain TCs. Now, for economic reasons, if you say then to promote the cultural industries, thereby helping in the development of the communities. In some cases, TCs are already protected by the customary law, and there is need to develop a formal legal framework for the protection. Now, for example, when the TCs are protected by customary law, if I give you an example of no, I'm not remembering that now. I'll come to it again if I remember. Now, coming to another point, right to control the use of TCs, traditional cultural expressions, especially by prior informed consent of local and traditional communities. So, when you're going for a protection of that, we especially need the permission of the people, of the community. It's not just like that by taking up by the traditional, their expression, the TCs, and saying that we need a protection of it. So, if you're going for a protection, if a particular community, if we want that there should be a protection of the traditional cultural expression of a particular community, we need to first inform them. We need to take the permission from that particular community that your particular traditional cultural expression is going to be, we are actually going for a protection of that. So you need to get a prior informed consent from those people. Again, to ensure that the use is in accordance with the traditional and customary way of which is not offensive to the traditional community. So if you are using the traditional and the traditional and customary way of that particular community, it should not be, you should not use it in such a way which is offensive to that traditional community. And if that particular community thinks that it is an offensive to that community because you're innovating something new in it, giving it a different nature, giving it a different phase, which is offensive to the community, to the traditional community, then definitely that should not be, they should always go, the community can always go that there is an infringement of it, and they should not go for the protection of, they should not give it to that particular, for the protection of that. Again, coming to ensure that there is no use of sacred or secret TCs in way which is not acceptable to the traditional community. So as I told you earlier also, that if the community is not prior informed, if you are not taking the permission from that particular community in such a manner, also you are not doing it in such a manner so that it may be a secret protection, definitely it is offensive to them, or it is not acceptable by the particular community. It is against the particular community. So if the entire thing is acceptable to the traditional community, then only you should go for protection of that. And when I'm saying you should go, who is this you? This you is actually the non-governmental organizations or the government who is coming forward for going for the protection of that traditional cultural expression. Coming again to another point, which is to see that there is acknowledgement of the source or the origin of used TCs. So if there is no acknowledgement, as I gave you an example of the Kalbelia dance, which is being performed by the Rajasthani people, the Saperas of Rajasthan. So if somebody is using the dance for a cultural purpose or for any other, in a stage performance, there should be an acknowledgement of the source that this dance is being taken, or it is, the original source is the Rajasthani Kalbelia dance. So that the acknowledgement is there that it is a traditional, a folklore of that particular community. You are not, even if you have innovated in it something, the acknowledgement should always be there, because if you're not acknowledging that it has been taken from this source, or this is the origin of the TCs, then definitely you're infringing the law, their particular, it is an infringement. Again, coming to another point, which is authenticity needs so that there is no misleading indications to consumers about the origin of products. So when coming to products, for example, if you're selling something, a Banarsi sari is there. So there should be, because there is a GI tag. Now this type of protection, this type of, when it comes to a skilled artisan thing, like a Banarsi sari or a Kolhapuri chappal, it is being protected under the GIs. There is a protection under the GIs, but sometimes what happens that there may not be a protection. They may not have a protection on that. In that case, there shouldn't be a misleading indication to the consumer that this is an original product, and you are not telling about the original of that product. So origin should always be mentioned, that it is coming from, what is the source of that. And the final very important point is that to ensure that there is no interference with continuing development with the tradition of local communities. So we should let them innovate in their own community. Now, with that, I think I've covered 3-4 very important points of the traditional cultural expressions for the protection of traditional cultural expressions. And let me wind up in a minute. So what we have covered in this session is that first we have come to know about the meaning of traditional cultural expression. What is traditional cultural expression? And what are the characteristics of traditional cultural expressions? How you will know that it is a traditional cultural expressions. So there are certain points which is inclusive in nature. It is not exhaustive in nature. It is inclusive in nature, which still you can include. So seeing that list, you can say that these are the characteristics of TCs. Coming to the third part, which I have covered, is the subject matter under the TCs. What are covered in the subject matter under the traditional cultural expressions? And finally, why traditional cultural expressions should be protected. So I've also covered what the reasons for the protection of TCs. So with that, I come to an end of the session. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Thank you very much.
My name is Dr. Jyoti Sharma. I have done